The table was set for a meal no one would ever eat. A child's toys lay where small hands had left them. The captain's logbook sat in his cabin, the ink long dry, the last entry made 10 days before. Up on deck, a single sounding rod rested near an open hatch, and one of the ship's pumps had been pulled apart, its pieces scattered on the boards. The sails were still up, some of them, catching the wind, and the ship was steering herself across the open Atlantic, hundreds of miles from any coast. She was sound, she was loaded, her cargo had not been touched, and every living soul who had stepped aboard her 5 weeks earlier was gone. No bodies, no blood anyone could be sure of, no note. Just a fine merchant ship, dressed for the voyage, sailing on alone, with the wheel spinning loose, and 10 empty places where 10 people used to be. The men who climbed aboard her that gray December afternoon would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain what they had seen. The question they asked is the one you are asking right now. Where did everybody go? Her name was the Mary Celeste, and to understand why she still unsettles people more than 150 years later, you have to understand that there was nothing strange about her at all. She was a working ship, a brigantine, a little under 100 feet long, built to haul cargo across the ocean and turn a profit doing it. There was no curse stamped on her hull, whatever you may have heard. There was no ghost in her rigging. She was wood and canvas and rope, owned by businessmen, sailed by professionals, insured like any other vessel of her day. This was not a doomed expedition into the unknown. It was a routine run from one port to another, the kind of trip that happened 1,000 times a year without anyone writing a word about it. And somewhere in the middle of that ordinary crossing, something went so wrong that 10 people chose to leave a perfectly good ship in the middle of the sea, and not one of them was ever seen again. She had not always been called the Mary Celeste. She was built in 1861 on Spencer's Island in Nova Scotia, where shipwrights knew their trade. They launched her under the name Amazon, and from the start she carried a thin streak of bad luck. Her first captain fell ill and died within days of taking command. She collided with another ship in the English Channel and sank the other vessel. Sailors are a superstitious breed, and a ship with a record like that earns whispers. By the late 1860s, she had passed through several owners, run aground off Nova Scotia, and been written off as a wreck. An American buyer salvaged her, rebuilt her, lengthened her, and gave her American papers. In the winter of 1868, she was registered out of New York as the Mary Celeste. A new name was supposed to mean a new start. They thought the trouble was behind her. The man who would take her on her final voyage was Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs, and by every account that survives, he was about as steady and trustworthy a master as you could find. He was 37 years old, born into a family of New England sea captains, the kind of household where the ocean was simply the family business. He did not drink. He read his Bible. He had a reputation as careful, sober, and deeply competent. A captain who did things by the book because the book kept people alive. Briggs had bought a share in the Mary Celeste himself, which meant her success was his own. This was no reckless gambler chasing a fortune. This was a part owner with money on the line and his own family aboard, a man with every reason in the world to bring that ship safely into port. Because his family was aboard, that detail matters more than any other. Briggs brought his wife, Sarah Elizabeth, who was 30, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia Matilda. They left their 7-year-old son at home with relatives so he could keep up his schooling, but the little girl came along. Sarah brought a small melodeon, a kind of reed organ, into the cabin because she liked to play music at sea. Picture that for a moment. A young mother, her toddler, a portable organ tucked into a ship's cabin for the long Atlantic nights. Whatever happened on the Mary Celeste happened to a family, not just to a crew, and no theory about her fate is worth much if it forgets that a mother and a baby were standing on that deck. The rest of the company was small and, as far as anyone could tell, sound. The first mate was Albert Richardson, an experienced American sailor who had served under Briggs before and was trusted by him. The second mate was Andrew Gilling, a young man in his 20s, born in New York, of Danish stock. The steward and cook was Edward William Head, 23 years old and recently married. And then there were 4 ordinary seamen, all of them Germans from the Frisian Islands off the North Sea coast. 2 were brothers, Volkert and Boz Lorenzen. The other 2 were Arian Martins and Gottlieb Goodshod. Briggs wrote to his mother before sailing that he thought he had a capable crew, and he was not a man given to false comfort. 10 people in all, 1 captain, his wife, his small daughter, 2 mates, a cook, and 4 hands. Remember that number, 10. It is the heart of the whole mystery, because in the end, every single one of them disappeared. The cargo was the kind of thing that sounds dull until you understand what it could do. The Mary Celeste was loaded with 1,701 barrels of raw industrial alcohol bound for Genoa, in Italy, where it would be used to fortify wine and for other commercial purposes. This was not something anyone aboard would want to drink. It was harsh, high-proof spirit, the sort that could blind or kill a man who tried. The barrels were stowed below in the hold, packed tight, more than 1,700 of them, and the value of that cargo was considerable. It was insured. The ship was insured. Everything about this voyage was buttoned down and accounted for, which is what investigators would keep coming back to later. People do not abandon insured cargo and a seaworthy hull on a whim. And yet, the Mary Celeste left Pier 50 on the East River in New York at the start of November 1872. The weather that week was foul, gray, and gusting, and Briggs, careful as always, did not push out into it straight away. He took the ship into the harbor and dropped anchor for a couple of days off Staten Island to wait for the sky to settle. While they sat there, Sarah used the pause to write one last letter home to her husband's mother. It was a calm, ordinary, domestic letter, the kind anyone might write before a trip. Nothing in it hints at fear, nothing suggests anyone aboard sensed the slightest shadow over the voyage. Then, on the 7th of November, the weather cleared enough to suit the captain, and the Mary Celeste weighed anchor and put out to sea, bound east across the Atlantic for Italy. That letter was the last word any of their families would ever receive from a living member of the ship's company. 8 days behind her, another ship cleared New York Harbor on the same general route. She was the Dei Grazia, a brigantine much like the Mary Celeste, under a Canadian captain named David Morehouse. By an odd turn of fate, Morehouse knew Briggs. The 2 men had dined together not long before either ship sailed, 2 captains carrying 2 cargoes across the same cold ocean toward the same part of the world. Morehouse had no reason to think about the Mary Celeste once he was at sea. She was well ahead of him, and he expected she would reach Genoa long before he did. The Atlantic is a wide and empty place, and the odds of one ship crossing the exact path of another out there are slim. But that is precisely what happened. It was the afternoon of the 4th of December, 1872. The Dei Grazia was roughly midway between the Azores Islands and the coast of Portugal, hundreds of miles from anywhere, when the men on watch spotted a sail in the distance. As they drew closer, they began to feel that something was off. The ship ahead of them was not behaving the way a ship should. She was yawing, drifting off her heading, her sails set in a strange and ragged way, some spread, some furled, some hanging loose and torn. No signal flags, no answer to their hail. She wobbled along like a vessel with no hand on the wheel, because that, it turned out, was exactly what she was. Morehouse studied her through his glass and recognized her lines. It was the Mary Celeste, the very ship his friend Briggs commanded, the ship that should have been tied up safe in Genoa by now, wandering alone in the middle of the sea. Morehouse sent his chief mate, a man named Oliver Devoe, across in a small boat with 2 others, to find out what was wrong. They climbed aboard a ship that, from the rail, looked almost normal, and the moment they were on her deck, the wrongness pressed in on them. There was no one there. They called out. Nothing answered but the wind and the creak of the rigging. They went below, into the cabins, and what they found has been told and retold ever since, because it is so quiet and so ordinary and so completely impossible. The ship was abandoned, but it had not been ransacked. The captain's cabin held Sarah's melodeon, sheet music, the family's clothing, even a sewing machine, all in place. Sophia's small things were where a child would leave them. In the galley, the cooking gear was stowed. There was food in the stores, and fresh water, enough to last the voyage. The crew's belongings, their pipes, their oilskins, their effects, were still in the forecastle. Whoever left this ship had left almost everything they owned behind, and there were details that made it stranger still. The hatches over the hold had been opened, the covers lifted off, and set aside on deck rather than blown away. One of the two pumps had been taken apart, its workings exposed. A length of rope was found trailing off the stern into the water. The single lifeboat, a small yawl that had been carried, lashed across the main hatch, was gone. The ship's register and navigational papers were missing, along with the captain's chronometer and sextant, the instruments a master uses to find his position. The logbook itself was still aboard, and its final entry was dated the 25th of November, 9 or 10 days before the Dei Gratia ever laid eyes on her. The log placed the Mary Celeste near the island of Santa Maria, at the eastern edge of the Azores, and it recorded nothing alarming. No storm worth fleeing, no emergency, no mutiny, no fire, just a routine note of a ship making her way, and then silence, and then 9 days of empty ocean while she sailed on without a soul to guide her. There was water in her hold, around 3.5 feet of it, sloshing in the bottom. To a nervous mind it might have looked like the ship was sinking, but Devoe, a working sailor who knew vessels, did not think she was in danger. 3.5 feet of water in the bilge of a ship that size was a problem, not a death sentence. The cargo was largely dry. The hull was sound. She was not going down. Devoe and his men later said they believed the Mary Celeste was perfectly capable of completing her voyage, and that is the knot at the center of everything. The ship that 10 people abandoned in such a hurry that they left their food and their clothes and the captain's wife's music behind was not, by any honest measure, a ship that needed abandoning. Morehouse made a hard decision. He split his own small crew, put some of his men aboard the derelict, and sailed both ships toward Gibraltar, the nearest port with a British Admiralty court, several hundred miles to the east. It was grueling work to bring a short-handed ship that distance, but salvage law promised a substantial reward to a crew that rescued an abandoned vessel and its cargo. Both ships reached Gibraltar in mid-December, and there, instead of gratitude and a clean payout, the men of the Dei Gratia sailed straight into suspicion. The man waiting for them was Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General of Gibraltar and the Queen's advocate, and he was, to put it gently, not inclined to accept a simple story. He was a proud, stubborn official with a flair for drama and a deep conviction that something sinister had taken place. He looked at this fine ship, abandoned for no reason anyone could explain, and his mind went straight to foul play. He impounded the Mary Celeste, opened a formal inquiry, and set about trying to prove a crime had been committed. He had the ship examined inch by inch and seized on every mark and stain. He found what he thought were cuts in the hull near the bow, scoring along the wood that he decided was the work of an axe. He found a sword beneath the captain's bunk, with what looked to him like stains on the blade, and he convinced himself it was blood. Here, at last, he thought, was the proof. His first theory was lurid and direct. The crew, he argued, had broken into the alcohol cargo, gotten roaring drunk, and in their stupor had murdered Captain Briggs, his wife, his child, and the officers, then fled in the lifeboat to cover their crime. It is the kind of story that writes itself, and Flood clearly liked it. But it fell apart under the simplest examination. The cargo was raw industrial alcohol, the sort of thing that would sicken or kill a man long before it gave him a pleasant drunk. No sailor was getting merrily intoxicated on that, and the stains on the sword, when they were finally tested, were not blood at all. The marks on the hull were consistent with the ordinary weathering a wooden ship takes at sea, not the strokes of an axe. Piece by piece, the evidence of murder evaporated in Flood's hands, and still he held on, because he could not believe that 10 people would vanish from a sound ship for no reason. Few people can. He turned his suspicion next on the rescuers themselves. Perhaps, he suggested, Morehouse and his men had done away with the crew of the Mary Celeste to claim the salvage money. But this did not hold either. The Dei Gratia had cleared New York more than a week after the Mary Celeste, and there was no way to put the two ships in the same place at the right moment for such a plot. Morehouse and his men had behaved exactly as honest salvors should, risking their own safety and splitting their crew to bring the ship in. After months of insinuation, the court found no evidence whatsoever of any crime by the Dei Gratia, and Flood's darker theories were quietly set aside. In the end, the Admiralty Court awarded Morehouse and his crew their salvage payment, though it was a meager one, around £1,700, only a fraction of what the ship and cargo were worth. The unusually small award was itself a kind of insult, a signal that the court still harbored a faint, unproven suspicion that the rescuers had not told the whole truth. The Mary Celeste, her papers finally cleared, was handed back to her owners. Her cargo of alcohol was delivered on to Genoa, very nearly intact, short by only a small amount. The voyage was completed. The ship survived, and the 10 people who had set out on her remained exactly as missing as the day DeVoe climbed her empty deck. The inquiry that was supposed to find an answer found only that there was no answer to find. Officially, the fate of the Mary Celeste was left open. And into that hole, over the years that followed, the world poured every story it could imagine. Here is where we have to stop and pull two threads apart because they have been tangled together for so long that most people cannot tell which is which. There is the real Mary Celeste, the actual ship with the actual facts you have just heard. And then there is the legend, a glossy, terrifying, mostly invented version. The single biggest reason the two are confused is a young doctor in England who was a few years away from inventing the most famous detective in the world. In January of 1884, a magazine called The Cornhill published a short story titled J. Habakkuk Jepson's Statement. It was fiction, told in the voice of a survivor, and it was written by Arthur Conan Doyle, who would soon give the world Sherlock Holmes. Doyle took the bones of the real case and dressed them in pure invention. In his version, the ship was found with hot food still steaming on the table, a meal half eaten as if the diners had stood up and walked into thin air mid-bite. He added a vengeful passenger, a plot of murder and revenge, a whole melodrama that never happened. He even got the ship's name slightly wrong, calling her the Mary Celeste, and his story was so vivid that the public swallowed it whole, assuming it was a true account. The fake name, Mary Celeste, stuck so hard that to this day, many people use it without realizing it is a novelist's error. The steaming food, the abandoned meal, the warm teacups, all of it traces back to Doyle's imagination, not to anything Oliver DeVoe actually found. Once the door to invention was open, it never closed. Later writers piled on. They claimed the breakfast was still warm and the eggs still cooking, that there was a cat asleep and undisturbed, a phantom last log entry full of dread. They threw in pirates, sea monsters, and in the 20th century, inevitably, aliens and the supernatural. Some pointed at the Bermuda Triangle, never mind that the ship was found nowhere near it, on the far side of the Atlantic by the coast of Portugal. Every retelling sanded down the dull, true edges and sharpened the spooky ones until the real ship was buried under a mountain of ghost story. To understand what happened to the Mary Celeste, the first thing you have to do is throw all of that out. No warm food, no abandoned meal, no supernatural anything. Just 10 missing people, a sound ship, a missing lifeboat, and a handful of stubborn physical clues. So let us take those clues seriously and look at the explanations honest people have offered. The legend is nonsense, but the real mystery is genuine, and a few of the theories deserve a fair hearing. The strongest of them begins with the cargo. When the Mary Celeste's barrels were finally unloaded in Genoa, the merchants found that 9 of the 1,701 were empty. Just 9, out of more than 1,700. For a long time this seemed like a minor footnote. But those 9 barrels may be the most important clue in the entire case. The empty ones were made of red oak, while the rest were white oak. Red oak is more porous, more prone to leaking and breathing than the tighter white oak. Those 9 would have been the ones most likely to seep their contents, releasing alcohol vapor into the closed hold during the voyage. And the ship had crossed from the cold of New York into the warmer waters near the Azores. Warming temperatures, a sealed hold, leaking high-proof alcohol. That is a recipe for a buildup of invisible, flammable fumes pressing against the underside of the deck. This is where a modern scientist enters the story. A chemist at University College London named Andrea Sella decided to test what such a buildup might actually do. He built a model of the Mary Celeste's hold, filled it with flammable vapor, and set it off to see what kind of explosion alcohol fumes would produce in that space. What he found was startling. The blast was a pressure wave, a sudden violent whump of flame and force, but it was a cool burn. It blew with shocking power, enough to lift hatch covers and terrify anyone nearby, yet it left almost no trace behind. No scorching, no soot, no fire damage to the wood. A flash of flame, a bang, a wave of pressure, and then nothing but the smell and the fear. That matters enormously, because the Mary Celeste showed no signs of fire when she was found. The absence of burn marks had always been used to rule out any explosion. Sella's experiment suggested the opposite. An alcohol vapor blast could have happened and left no mark at all. Picture it on the deck of the real ship. The crew, perhaps already uneasy about the smell rising from the hold, perhaps in the middle of opening the hatches to air the cargo out. And then, without warning, a sound from below. A loud crack. A rush of pressure. The hatch covers leaping. To a captain like Briggs, careful and responsible, with his wife and his baby daughter aboard, sitting on top of more than 1,700 barrels of explosive spirit, that single moment could have changed everything. He had no way to know whether it was the first warning of a blast that would tear the ship apart and kill them all, or a one-time release. Faced with the possibility of his family being blown to pieces, a prudent man might make a terrible, fatal decision. Get everyone off, now, into the boat, get clear of the ship until the danger passes. And the physical evidence on the deck fits that picture with uncomfortable neatness. The hatch covers were off, lying on deck rather than blown into the sea, consistent with a controlled opening or a gentle pressure release rather than a shattering blast. The single lifeboat, the yawl, was gone, launched. And here is the detail that may tie it all together. That length of rope found trailing from the stern into the water. The leading reconstruction holds that Briggs got his family and crew into the yawl, and then, instead of cutting loose entirely, had the boat tied to the ship by a long line. They would ride behind the Mary Celeste at a safe distance, waiting to see if she blew. If she settled and the danger passed, they could haul themselves back aboard and continue. It was a careful man's plan, an attempt to have it both ways, to flee the danger without losing the ship. But the sea does not bargain. Imagine that small open boat, 10 people crowded into it, a mother and a toddler among them, bobbing on a long rope behind a ship that is still under sail and still moving through the water. The wind freshens, the line goes taut and strains. Somewhere in that tense, jostling few minutes, the rope parts, or the knot fails, or it is cut by mistake, and in an instant, the Mary Celeste, with her sails still drawing, pulls away. She gathers speed. The little yawl, with no mast and 10 terrified people aboard, cannot catch her. They watch their ship, their food, their water, their only real safety, shrink toward the horizon and vanish. And they are left in an open boat in the middle of the Atlantic, hundreds of miles from land. The rest does not take long. Exposure, thirst, the open ocean. The sea swallows them without a trace, which is exactly what the sea does. Meanwhile, the ship that frightened them into leaving sails serenely on, unharmed, alone, until the day Gratia finds her 9 days later with the cabins in order and not one living soul aboard. That is the strongest theory, and it explains nearly everything. But honesty demands that we look at the others, because no one alive can prove which is right. One competing idea points the finger at the captain's instruments. The Mary Celeste carried a chronometer, a precise clock used to calculate longitude at sea, and if that chronometer was running fast or slow, even by a little, Briggs could have believed he was somewhere he was not. Some who have studied the case argue he may have thought the ship was further along than she was, or misjudged his position near the rocky island of Santa Maria. In a moment of doubt, with shoals possibly near and his reckoning uncertain, he might have feared running aground and ordered everyone into the boat, with the same deadly result. The chronometer and the sextant were missing from the ship, taken into the boat, which tells us the people who left were thinking about navigation, not fleeing a fire in blind panic. That fits a careful, planned departure of exactly the kind both the alcohol and the chronometer theories describe. Another explanation focuses on that disassembled pump and the sounding rod found on the deck. A sounding rod was used to measure how much water had collected in the bilge. With one pump taken apart and out of action, and 3.5 feet of water already in the hold, it is possible the crew tried to sound the depth and got a frightening, misleading reading. If the working pump seemed to be losing the battle, Briggs might have wrongly concluded the ship was filling beyond saving. A captain who believes his ship is sinking will abandon her, even if she is not. Again, the boat. Again, the long rope. Again, the same end. Then there are the weather theories. The Atlantic in late autumn is no gentle place, and some have proposed that the Mary Celeste was struck by a sudden violent squall, or even a waterspout, one of those whirling columns of wind and water that can appear over the ocean without warning. The low pressure inside such a column can cause water in an enclosed hold to surge upward, which might have driven bilge water high enough to make the situation look catastrophic from the deck. It could account for the damaged sails, and it could have terrified an experienced captain into a hasty evacuation. This theory has its supporters, though it asks us to believe in a freak event for which there is no direct proof, only the suggestive state of the rigging. What about the human explanations, the ones Solly Flood loved? Could it have been mutiny or murder after all? Almost certainly not. There was no real blood, no bodies, no sign of a struggle in the orderly cabins, no plausible motive among a crew Briggs himself trusted, and the missing navigational gear points to people trying to survive, not killers covering their tracks. Could it have been piracy? No. Pirates would have stripped the ship of its cargo and stores, and they took nothing. The barrels of alcohol arrived in Genoa. The sewing machine, the melodeon, the valuables were all still aboard. No pirate boards a loaded ship and leaves the loot. And the supernatural explanations are not explanations at all. They are the absence of one, dressed up in costume. So where does that leave us, honestly, when the legends are stripped away and the evidence is laid out plain? It leaves us with a verdict that is sober and frustrating, and, I think, true. Almost certainly, no one murdered the people of the Mary Celeste. Almost certainly, Nothing supernatural touched her. What happened, in all likelihood, is the saddest and most human thing of all. Something aboard that ship, the threat of leaking alcohol, a feared explosion, a misread of the water in the hold, a navigational fright, or some combination of these, convinced a careful, responsible captain that staying aboard for the next few minutes was more dangerous than getting his people into the boat. He made a reasonable decision on the information he had, and tied the boat to the ship so as not to lose her. And the margin between caution and catastrophe turned out to be a single straining rope. It snapped. The ship sailed on. The boat could not follow. And 10 people, including a young mother and a 2-year-old girl, were left to the mercy of an ocean that has none. It was, most likely, an orderly abandonment that went terribly wrong. Not a horror story, a tragedy of inches. The kind of thing that happens when good judgment meets bad luck on a sea that does not forgive mistakes. We cannot prove it. The chronometer is gone, the boat is gone, the people are gone, and the only witnesses sank beneath the waves a century and a half ago. But of all the explanations, this one asks us to believe in nothing impossible. Only in fear, and in a frayed line, and in the cruel arithmetic of the sea. The Mary Celeste herself sailed on for another 12 years, though her reputation as an unlucky ship clung to her, and the owners who came and went never prospered. Her end was no mystery at all. In early 1885, a captain deliberately ran her onto a reef off the coast of Haiti, packed with a worthless cargo, in a clumsy attempt at insurance fraud. The scheme was uncovered, the ship was a loss, and that was the end of the brigantine that had outlived her own captain and crew by 13 years. She did not vanish into legend. She was wrecked on purpose, for money, by a man who got caught. There is something almost bitter in that a ship swallowed by the deepest mystery of the age should die in such a small, grubby fraud. But it is the 10 who stay with you, not the ship, the people. Benjamin Briggs, who did everything right his whole life, who brought his family along because he loved them, and the voyage was supposed to be safe. Sarah, who packed a little organ to fill the long nights with music. Sophia, 2 years old, with her toys scattered in the cabin. The mates and the cook and the 4 German sailors far from the cold islands where they were born. They stepped onto a sound ship on a routine voyage, and somewhere out on the gray Atlantic, they made a choice that any of us might have made. To be careful, to step back from danger, to wait it out, and the choice killed them. They climbed into a small boat tied to their ship by a rope, and they trusted that rope to hold. It did not hold. The next time you hear the Mary Celeste called a ghost ship, remember that there are no ghosts in this story. There is only a family and a crew, and a moment of fear and a knot that came undone in the middle of the sea. The ship was found because she could not sink. The people were never found because the ocean is very large and very deep and keeps what it takes. That is the whole of the mystery, and the worst of it, and the truest of it. A perfect ship, a full cargo, a set table, and 10 empty places, sailing on alone toward a port her people would never see. If stories like this one, the real ones, the forgotten ones, the ones the legends got wrong, are the kind of thing you want more of, then you already know what to do.